All right, everybody, welcome back to Getting Technical with your favorite folks here at J.R. Peters. It's myself, Mason Day, and Dan Gillespie, and this week we're talking about fertigation and continuous liquid feed. So, obviously, Dan, it's Super Bowl weekend. Now, Super Bowl might mean something different to a lot of our growers out there, if you know what I mean. But yeah, Super Bowl weekend, we're talking about snacks and feeding. So we figured, it's time to talk about what about when you're feeding your plants? Should we be feeding every watering? How much? What is fertigation? So we'll start there. So Dan, what is fertigation and continuous liquid feed? Or from here on out, we're going to refer to it as CLF because that's a mouthful.
Yeah, Mason. So fertigation is the feeding of plants by injecting a nutrient solution into an irrigation system, which may consist of injectors, drip lines, or drip stakes. And a nutrient solution is just water and fertilizer mixed together into the fertilizer dissolved in that solution. So fertigation systems are often used to feed crops with a continuous liquid feed or CLF. So a continuous liquid feed, Mason, is feeding crops a low nutrient composition in small volumes multiple times throughout the day. So this practice is going to supply a consistent and balanced nutrient supply to the plant root zone at every fertigation event. And although constant liquid feeds are very beneficial in that they can enhance plant growth and can be used to steer plant growth, proper scheduling and management are going to be critical in success when employing fertigation and continuous liquid feed programs.
All right. That reminds me of all those cereal commercials when we were kids. It's like, oh, this can be part of a well-balanced breakfast. But so how do we develop a fertigation strategy and schedule from there?
Yeah, so this is difficult, Mason, because it's such a dynamic relationship and there's so many things that are dependent upon each other. So the way I like to break developing a fertigation schedule down is thinking a fertigation schedule is a function of three different things, and they're all going to be somewhat dependent upon each other. And those three things would be nutrient composition, which is going to be the ratio and the concentration of the nutrients in the solution that are being delivered to the plants. Number two, we have our fertigation dose. The fertigation dose would be the volume of the nutrient solution that is going to be delivered to the plant at each fertigation event. And then the fertigation frequency. So how many or how often are we fertigating a plant per day, or how many fertigation events occur in a day. So often, as I mentioned, in continuous liquid feed programs, the crop is often going to be fertigated many times throughout the day at lower volumes, typically about 100 to 200 milliliters of nutrient solution per fertigation event.
Okay, makes sense. One of the biggest questions that I get all the time from folks on Instagram is how many times a day should I be feeding? So, playing that out on a bigger scale, when you talk about those three things, how do we determine what those three things are and bring it all together into a plan?
Yeah, it's a great question, Mason. And so, as I mentioned, all of these factors are going to be dependent upon each other, right? So it is a very dynamic relationship. So changing one is likely going to impact the other. So obviously, if we're giving a plant a large volume of nutrient solution, we maybe don't need to the frequency of the fertigation events may decrease or vice versa. So they all kind of need to be accounted for together. So due to this dynamic relationship between the nutrient composition, the fertigation dose, and the fertigation frequency, there is not going to be a one-size-fits-all fertilizer program. So growers, they really need to evaluate each of these parameters to determine the most appropriate fertigation schedule for them. So, typically you can start with the nutrient composition when you're building out your program. And mainly this is going to depend on the source water, the environment, the plant species that's being grown, and the media. And we've talked about that in previous videos. But determining the dose and the frequency, it can really help, and really it kind of requires us to monitor the EC of the root zone environment.
Okay, cool. Yeah, actually, you think about it, it's similar to people's diets, right? You have some people that like to eat one huge meal a day. intermittent fasting, right? And you have other people that are like, oh, I have to eat 20 small meals throughout the day. So it really depends on what you need, what your grow needs, what your plants need. So cool, understood. So how do we monitor and measure, all of this, and how do we use the data to develop our schedule?
Yeah, so Mason, when we get the question a lot of the time is how often should I feed? Should I be feeding with every watering? The short answer is yes, you can be feeding with every watering, but you should be monitoring the input EC and the output EC, or the leachate drainage EC. So this data, it really provides an indication of the root zone fertility levels and whether salinity problems are likely to exist. So in many cases, the EC of the runoff solution, so the solution that's draining out of the grow media or the container, is going to be a little bit higher than the input solution. That's pretty typical. However, if the runoff EC is really starting to begin to really climb up on us and get a lot higher than the input EC, so I'm talking, and again, this is plant species dependent and situation dependent, but if your output EC is starting to approach 1.0 higher EC than what you're putting in, so if you're putting in an EC of 2 and it's coming out above 3, this may indicate you're starting to have some fertilizer build up in that root zone. And hey, go in with a clear water irrigation or two to get the EC of that root zone back down a little bit, and then you can resume fertigating.
So Dan, why does that happen, and how do we correct that rapidly rising EC? Is it just the flushing of that with some clear water solution?
Yeah, Mason. So remember, as I mentioned, it is typical for the runoff EC to be a little bit higher than the input EC, right? But if that runoff EC is really rapidly climbing on us, we may need to consider increasing the fertigation dose or increasing the fertigation frequency to allow for more drainage to help wash those salts out of the root zone, right? So if the EC is really starting to shoot up on us quickly, increasing the fertigation dose or the fertigation frequency will help flush out some of those salts that are contributing to that rising EC, which should help improve the rapidly rising EC. Now, if that's not helping, then we may need to reevaluate the nutrient composition or some of the physical properties of the grow media that we're using, because that could also be causing issues as well.
And I just want to kind of harken back there, is that when you're talking fertigation dose, you're not saying the rate of fertilizer within the water you're using, but the overall quantity of water that you're using for that fertigation event, correct?
Exactly, Mason. So the fertigation dose is going to be the volume of nutrient solution applied at a particular fertigation event.
Awesome. That makes sense. So now, what if we flip it around and our output EC is less than our input EC?
Yep. So alternatively, if our runoff EC is measuring lower than the input EC, this may indicate luxury application, or the grow media may have too much porosity, so things are just draining out very quickly. So in these cases, the fertigation dose or the frequency may be dialed back a little bit to save water, fertilizer, or just decreasing the porosity of the grow media should help as well, or should be evaluated at least.
Okay, so to make sure I'm understanding correctly, it is critical to monitor the root environment EC and adjust and manage your dose and frequency as need based on what we're experiencing. So, just to know, are we coming in higher or lower than what we should be, and how to make changes on both of those.
Yeah, I think that, to kind of wrap it up, Mason, is continuous liquid feed programs designed to feed the crop with every watering, but you need to monitor and manage the root zone accordingly. So if we're seeing the runoff EC rapidly rise higher than the input EC, we need to think about increasing the fertigation dose or the fertigation frequency throughout the day to help wash away some of those salts and increase our drainage and runoff volume. Alternatively, if the output EC is lower than the input EC, we can likely dial back our dose and frequency, or we may want to consider a grow media that allows for less drainage.
All right. Well, sweet. I'm not understanding that. So hopefully everybody else, this, kind of fits in and gives a good, clear picture of, why EC is important, how to measure those runoff ECs, and helps people understand that, it isn't about feeding once a day or twice a day or 5 times a day. It's about figuring out, what works for you, measuring your EC and checking, am I getting too much nutrients out? Am I not seeing enough? Are things just draining out, unnecessarily?
Yep.
So that helps. And so Dan, again, thanks today for jumping on, and glad we got to chat about this. And can't wait to see you guys all next week. And again, if you guys have any questions on things that you want to see or hear about from Dan and I, we'd love to hear them. And so until then, have a great Super Bowl weekend, and we'll catch you next week.
All right, Mason.